So hello everyone, my name's Chris Murphy. So my background is I've worked as a bureaucrat in the federal government for more than 20 years in Ministry of Environmental Impact Assessment. In that role I've had oversight of hundreds of environmental impact assessments in every state and territory. However, I find much of the debate around offsetting biodiversity under EIA and SEA assessment processes to be misguided at best and counterproductive at worst. Now, I don't speak for the Commonwealth Government. I quit that 2 years ago, so I can speak openly about this sort of stuff. Now, the economist Herbert Simons stated that we make decisions within the space of bounded rationality and see the world through different lenses. And he said, to predict how economic man will behave, we need to know that he is not only rational, but how he perceives the world, what alternatives he sees and what consequences he attaches to them. Now, one of the biggest problems we have is proponents speak the jargon of market economics, while environmentalists speak the jargon of environmental stewardship. So the potential for dialogue is severely constrained, because the language of each side shapes how they interpret the world. In other words, they have asymmetric interests, and it's important to think about the asymmetry of interests of those who participate in the processes. Now, in 2004, the Australian government started to systematically require offsets for impacts to biodiversity under the EPBC Act. It wasn't under any formal policy decision. Prior to that, mitigation was a primary means of reducing impacts. So the impacts of projects were being reduced by square metres or even tens of square metres, while the actual footprints of projects result in impacts of tens of hectares and hundreds of hectares and sometimes even thousands of hectares. That disconnect between the focus on mitigation and the actual impacts of the footprints occurred because the impacts of footprints were generally regarded as economic externalities. That is, biodiversity had no value. Therefore, before 2004, impact assessment processes had minimal influence of the magnitude of impacts on biodiversity. When systematic offsets were required, bureaucrats experienced significant blowback from almost every proponent, as proponents were subject to costs they were not previously exposed to. That is, the boundary conditions of environmental impact assessment had changed to evolutionary processes. There is a belief that offsetting for impacts to biodiversity has always occurred in Australia, but offsetting was previously rare, and I can go into the history in that, but that's a longer topic. It was more common in industry sectors that use market-based instruments to achieve their objectives to control emission of pollutants and manage resource use. Now, the International Convention on Biological Diversity refers to the obligation to avoid and minimise adverse impacts on biological diversity. That obligation has evolved into the so-called mitigation hierarchy, which requires the avoidance of impacts on biodiversity rather than mitigation, and mitigation of impacts rather than offsetting. However, that hierarchy expresses ideological aspirations rather than the sound process for practical implementation. If the avoidance step in the hierarchy was always implemented, developments would only occur on land devoid of biodiversity and no further steps would be required. And the notion of stepping from avoidance to mitigation lacks logic when avoidance is always possible. Projects don't have to go ahead. Discussion on the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy displays a level of subjectivity worthy of the obscurantism of postmodern philosophy. The mitigation hierarchy is predicated on the assumption that impact assessment is a simple linear system, whereas impact assessment occurs within a complex non-linear system which is influenced by a range of social, political and economic institutions. And I'm actually giving another talk after this called Reinvigorating Impact Assessment Through Complexity Theory, which was actually meant to be given before this talk. It actually gives a framework, a theoretical framework. There is a myth that the mitigation hierarchy to avoid, mitigate and then offset impacts is implemented in SEA and EIA, but that belief has no base in logic or reason. It's a case of the tail wagging the dog. Proponents respond to costs, not motherhood statements. So there is a direct relationship between the cost of offsetting impacts and the avoidance of impacts. In addition, the belief that implementing the mitigation hierarchy delivers better biodiversity outcomes has no basis in reality. Offsets are plastic and can easily be increased or reduced, and I'll speak more about that, about metrics and what have you. It isn't hard to picture scenarios of offsets delivering much better outcomes for biodiversity than avoidance. Therefore, the mitigation hierarchy is an expression of dogma rather than a scientifically valid proposition based on empirical evidence and robust theory. Now, proponents will avoid impacts in certain circumstances. That is, if the cost of the impact assessment process itself is greater than the cost of the avoidance and they don't want to go through the process. Or if a project is likely to be refused because of the magnitude of the impacts, or if there is no additional or cost to actually avoid the impacts, or if there's significant political pressure to avoid impacts. In those cases, impacts will be avoided. However, environmentalists would like proponents to avoid impacts to biodiversity all of the time. They exhibit the psychological phenomenon of loss aversion, which means that biodiversity issues losses loom larger than gains for them. So offsetting was originally introduced by the Australian government to address the failure of EIA and SEA processes to achieve meaningful steps to minimise impacts, not to allow developments to occur. Impacts on biodiversity were no longer treated as economic externalities after offsetting was required. That encouraged proponents to avoid and mitigate impacts to reduce transaction costs, and also made some land uses uneconomic. We used to get more speculative projects prior to offsetting being introduced. Now, proponents may start the planning processes for projects years or even decades before submitting them for impact assessment. Therefore, proponents can make significant sunk costs in projects, which means that impact assessment processes rarely result in significant changes when they're submitted for assessment. Now, there are different types of constraints which influence EIA and SEA processes. The philosopher Alicia Warrero describes constraints as governing constraints and enabling constraints. EIA and SEA processes are enabling constraints as they just provide the legal scaffolding for decision making and a range of outcomes are possible. They generally don't define boundaries for the conservation of biodiversity that will influence project design. However, the mitigation hierarchy is a governing constraint. It seeks a particular outcome and constrains innovation. EIA and SEA processes impose various transaction costs on those who wish to undertake projects with significant impacts. Those costs include the cost to undertake the assessment process itself, the cost of mitigation, and the cost of offsetting impacts. And the relative contribution of each of those transaction costs influences project design. The efforts taken to mitigate impacts vary significantly from project to project and are determined by projects' cost-benefit analysis. So for those undergoing assessment of their projects, money is measurable. And in the absence of legally prescribed thresholds for impacts on biodiversity in those processes, it becomes a significant default factor that influences project design. So the cost involved in offsetting is therefore a key factor in project planning. Now, both proponents and environmentalists dislike offsets, but for very different reasons, and I find this actually quite interesting. Proponents dislike the economic costs involved, while environmentalists dislike the loss of biodiversity. So they both agree they don't want offsets, but for very different reasons. However, environmentalists take a reduction approach to impacts on biodiversity. They focus on the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy to address potential impacts on individual projects rather than achieving holistic long-term conservation goals. That focus on the dogma of the mitigation hierarchy detracts from the effort spent on making holistic gains for biodiversity within a complex non-linear system. In addition, biodiversity is on the trajectory of decline, so the do-nothing option of avoidance just maintains that trajectory. Both protection of biodiversity and adequate management are required, and decline will continue unless funding is provided for both long-term protection and management of threats. Offsetting can be used as governing constraints or enabling constraints. So defined land-based metrics for offsetting are governing constraints as they stifle innovation in developing alternative measures and addressing landscape scale threats. So I don't agree in offsetting in the manner which it's often carried out in terms of some of the metrics that are used. The metrics are way too low to actually encourage more avoidance. In contrast, offsetting can be used as enabling constraints which allow for new adaptive institutions to emerge to conserve biodiversity. The future in offsetting is using it as an enabling constraint and integrating it with conservation objectives for bioregions. That entails analysing impact assessments as a complex non-linear system rather than focusing on individual projects. Some of the factors that should be considered in offsetting within a bioregion are the adequacy of public land protected for conservation, and I disagree with a lot of the stuff being done in terms of private land conservation. The adequacy of corridors between areas of public land protected for conservation. The adequacy of long-term funding for bioregional management of threats such as weeds and feral species, and also long-term research on adequacy, protection and funding of biodiversity, funding of the management of biodiversity. Now, anybody who's worked in government knows that environmental priorities change regularly. Therefore, an offsetting framework should facilitate the development of institutions that both protect and manage biodiversity in order to reverse its decline. And the offsetting framework should also reduce the reliance on government funding. Governments will have projects which go for a period of years, say 5 years, and I've been involved in the crazy ants within Christmas Island. 5 years, the crazy ant almost disappeared, 99% of them were gone. As a result of the funding, running out, that stopped, they came back a few years later, and on you go. So it's actually, the benefit in offsetting is actually about setting up systems, having trust funds set up, so you're actually implementing long-term management and you're not having a long-term reliance on governments. Thank you.